Alrighty, hello everyone, and welcome to today's session. Today I'm going to be looking at the early world, which is a bit of a different take again on compared to some of the things we've been looking at previously, but shortly you'll see the connection and why I was interested in this along the way. So this started with, I want to talk about Noah's flood and how that all kind of panned out and some of the evidence for those sorts of things, but I also want to touch on what happened in society before that. Or what society looked like before that in terms of a biblical perspective, but also afterwards. And it just got bloated and huge. And so today I'm going to focus on what life was like before the flood, or also in just an early Genesis in the Bible, and how things panned out and how they link up with what we, the evidence we have today. And then in our next session, I'll be doing a deep dive on Noah's Ark and what that looks like and the evidence for that in particular, because it's such a large topic in itself. And so today I want to look at common ancestors in terms of, the origins of man, caveman, that kind of stuff. And then the evidence that the world was just covered in water, so that's kind of laying the foundation for the Ark. And then how humans have moved around and also developed our technology and language. So if there's any ancient history buffs in here, you can tell me all about it later, because this isn't quite my, it's not quite my area of specialty, but I do find the number of links interesting, and we'll have a look at those today. All right, so before we get stuck in, I just want to give a brief history of everything. So this is from a scientific historical perspective. This is our best guess based on science and the evidence we have available to us. And so the prevailing theory is that Homo sapiens, or some sort of, modern humans, if you will, they originated 200 to 300,000 years ago. Some say up to 1 million, depends what you consider. So a long time ago, much longer than a 6,000 to 10,000 year age of the Earth, as might be expected from a little interpretation of the Bible and the family trees that we see there. And it says from that, so Homo sapiens are around doing their thing, foraging, gathering, and then about 50,000 years ago, they are supposed to have developed language, and they're also migrating just before that. So you might have heard of the Out of Africa theory, where early humans started in Africa and then began to spread out and colonize the world about 70,000 to 100,000 years ago, but we'll look at that as well. And so it's only really in recent times, the last 10,000 years, that humans are thought to have started farming, like domesticating animals, culturing cereals, about 10,000 years ago. And then even more recent again, we have written communication about 5,500 years BC. Even then, we're talking pictographs, hieroglyphics, rather than written language with characters. That had to wait until 3,500 BC. And so very long time ago, humans came into being. More recently-ish, they started moving and talking. It's only really in this last little part we've actually started to develop what we would think as terms in technology. And of course, even more recently with computers and that sort of stuff. All right, so that's the groundwork of, it's commonly accepted standard evidence for what we have and how that's interpreted in the mainstream today. And so this is a graphic of Out of Africa theory. So the idea is that Homo sapiens in the red originated in Africa, moved through the Middle East into Europe, and then all around through the earth. And these are all years, so it's taken them a long time to get to the furthest reaches, of course, New Zealand being the most recent, youngest nation on earth, they say. All right, and so through all this, I find some interesting connections between that and the Bible. Like if the Bible is just this random thing made by dudes for their own purposes, it wouldn't make any sense for it to line up sensibly with anything that's accepted to be fact as true based on the evidence. But it's remarkably accurate in terms of just the proportion and the sequencing of events and how they line up with what's predicted and so, or thought to have happened. And so while the years vary greatly, we're talking hundreds of thousands of years rather than just a few thousand, there's still this consistent flow and connections of similar ideas between these two. And so I would posit, like I've mentioned previously, that the assumptions that we base dates on are not foolproof. So it is entirely possible that that long time frame may be a little bit more compressed than what we might expect based on what's published. But also that those facts have to be interpreted through our brain biases, through our perspectives, as I mentioned in our previous video. And so once you consider that and the idea that you can press it and they start to line up a bit, it's like, well, hang on, maybe there's a bit more going on here than first meets the eye. And so I'm actually going to touch on each of these in today's session. This is what it's all about. And so the first one goes right back to the very beginning of humans. And so the biblical account says Adam and Eve were created in Genesis 2 in the beginning, and it was good. Whereas the scientific theory is, I know cavemen, they evolved from, lizards or whatever it was. But what scientists have done is they've identified what's called a mitochondrial Eve. And this is one person through all people living today. We all have this person in their family tree. And so Eve is just a name they took to do that. And they've done that through mitochondria. And we'll have a look at that shortly. And so again, science and Bible lining up with, a common ancestor, as you might expect. And then the second one is lots of water everywhere. So Noah's Ark and a flood, global flood, lots of water everywhere. That's the thing. But science says, yes, there was lots of water everywhere, but they were inland seas through periods of history. And so it was just water sitting there through higher sea levels or whatever it might have been, continental changes. But everyone agrees that there was a lot of water all over the place at some point. And it was a long time ago. It wasn't last week. And then moving onwards, we see movements coming out and spreading out from the Middle East. So the out of Africa theory is from Africa rather than the Middle East. But it's still interesting that seems to be the center of the world and is spread out from there. It's not Europe, it's not South America. It's through that Middle Eastern area that humans have begun their spread. So that's another commonality there. And I found it interesting that language and migration were closely linked. Yeah, I know it's 20,000 years apart, but in terms of that timescale, they're pretty close together. And there's no reason that talking and walking should really be linked in terms of the capabilities of humanity. And so it's interesting that the Tower of Babel in Genesis describes the development of both of those things at the same time and how they seem to be somewhat linked in terms of scientific perspective. And then more interestingly, the farming of plants and animals only in the last 10,000 years or so, which is pretty close to what the Bible might say the age of the entire earth and creation is. And Genesis gives an account of man working the land basically in the beginning. And so those dates more or less agree, probably about 10,000 years ago that humans began farming. And then more recently, we have that first written language and then the first books of the Bible being written as well a little after that. All right, so let's dive deeper into some of those connections. First one is Mitochondrial Eve. So I've got a couple of images here, artists' renditions, of course, depending who you ask, slightly different. And so Mitochondrial Eve is not the first human. That's not what they mean. That's not what the scientists have discovered. So this is the first female that all current humans can be traced to. So we all have her in this family tree. And scientists will go to great lengths to say that no, she was not the first female. She's simply the most recent female that we can trace everyone back to. There were probably females before her. But regardless, there is agreement that there is a common ancestor from all people today. So all people in their line have that descendants, have this person, have this Eve in there. And so where does the mitochondrial part come from? Well, mitochondria is a part of our cells. Our cells have little mini organs in them. And one of them is called the mitochondria. It's responsible for making energy for our cells, among other things. And so what's interesting about it, though, is it has its own separate DNA. We have all our DNA in one place, in the bundle, in the nucleus, in each of our cells, but we also have this little extra bit in our mitochondria, which is a bit weird and different. And so we're interested in this mitochondrial DNA because it gets passed directly from mother to child. Unchanged, unlike our other DNA, which gets mum and dad mixed together, and then you get this weird, wonderful, different person. Mitochondrial DNA is a straight cut and paste from mum to child. And so this is really cool because it doesn't change a lot over time. It doesn't have that intermingling, doesn't have that mixing. The only change we see over time is because of mutation caused by time or damage. And so it doesn't change as quickly as the rest of our DNA. So it's much, much easier to trace it. These very small changes going all the way back. And you just follow those similarities, see is the most similar. And then eventually you reach a point where we identify this mitochondrial Eve, where everyone came from this person. There's this similar DNA and the mitochondria, and then we can trace those slight variations from everyone coming back down. And so evolutionary speaking, they explain this mitochondrial DNA as a cell that just ate a bacteria which had its own DNA and it just kept living in there because reasons. I've always found that a bit strange, but apparently that's how it evolved. But I believe that God just made us that way and has its own little DNA, and it's useful to us. And so just one little tangent here. You may have heard of three-parent children as well. That's a result of this mitochondrial DNA. So if there's a mother whose mitochondrial DNA is damaged, and it's going to cause basically a lethal. All right, so back there. Apologies for the technical issue. So I touched on the idea earlier of three-parent children that result from mitochondrial DNA. So essentially, that's the idea that if someone has damaged mitochondrial DNA and the mother's going to pass that directly to a child, it's going to be bad for the child. And so what they've actually done is they've cut and pasted a different person's mitochondrial DNA and put that in there. So the mum and dad DNA, that mixes together normally, and then there's this little extra bit from the third person, three-parent children. So that's a new technology based on that little funky facet of that DNA. All right, so again, what's the purpose here? It's the idea that both science and the Bible is showing that we've come from a common ancestor. They're both called Eve, termed Eve. And yeah, there's a connection lined up there. So the next connection that I identified earlier was inland seas, or the idea that the whole place was just covered in water and stuff. Excuse me. So you can see on the right-hand side here, this is North America with water through it. And so apparently long ago, it's theorized that there was lots of inland oceans, seaways, just cutting straight through the middle of it, the two separate parts, and this was there for a long time. And so how do they know this stuff? Well, two main facets as far as I can tell. That's geological evidence and marine-specific, not just microbes, but larger organisms too, like mollusks. And so I've linked a paper there of an example, a scientific paper of one of these regions and how they've come across that geological evidence and marine biology. I couldn't read all of it, but you could get the idea that, hey, we found water things and the rocks are different, therefore there was water. And so there's also an Australian one that's a news article. It's a bit more readable because it's not a scientific paper, and you can see that there in the second link there. And so again, that seems pretty reasonable. You know, these rocks are watery and stuff, and there's water animals here. It was underwater, yes. But so how do we determine whether that was an inland sea for a period of time or whether it was a global flood or either or both? Who knows? But again, this is going to hinge on the assumptions of the individual when they do that. So uniformitarianism is the idea that things stayed the same. So that lends to an idea that these things have to have happened over a long time and developed slowly, and therefore they're like that for a long time, in a long time period, in an old Earth. But what is the fact? What's the unmitigatable fact? Well, these rocks are watery and there's water animals there. That is the fact. That is all we know for real. Anything from that is an assumption. So you've got to interpret that based on your assumptions, filter through your biases. From a uniformitarianism view, you're going to be thinking that was there for a long time. From a biblical view, you can be like, could have just been a flood? Pfft, lots of water. It's hanging around for a year. That's plenty of time to do all that sort of stuff. And plenty of reason for there to be ocean life at the top of mountains and all that kind of stuff. So again, the fact is this stuff was there. Interpretations diverge based on ideology from there. And there's a lot of evidence for water covering the Earth, not just the science in terms of what we find, but the fact that there are dozens, if not hundreds of cultures around the world which each have their own flood myth. And nearly always they're caused by a god or a deity of some kind. And so Wikipedia's got a big list. But a classic example is the Epic of Gilgamesh. They're actually quite similar. And there's an example article there which has like a nice table of similarities and differences there, so you can see that. So they rarely agree on the details, obviously. But this isn't surprising, really, because so the Genesis story says that Noah and his wife were saved along with their 3 sons and their wives. And it was only 4 generations later that the Tower of Babel happened, where, excuse me, where everyone had their languages mixed up and they were spread around the earth. And so 4 generations later, you know, they could still have this story of, wow, granddad and his big boat and all that sort of stuff. They'd be well versed in what it was. They spread about the world, a bit of time in Chinese whispers, and suddenly we have every culture on the earth having a flood myth. Originating from the one source, but just changed through language and time and people groups and cultures. And so we'd actually expect to see that when you think about it as a result of this. And a lot of Noah's sons, they were, they're known to be originators of settlements and places. And so a lot of places are actually named after the sons, because commonly, the first settler there, that person, the place and the family and the tribe, and they'd be known by that name. And so, for example, Ham's sons were Cush. Cush is an ancient name for Ethiopia, so they might have settled down in Africa. What's called Mizraim, I think, but that's an ancient name for Egypt. And then Canaan, they became the Canaanites in the Promised Land. So these sons and their families literally moved to places, formed places and tribes as a result, and they're all named. And so we'd expect them to have, originated from Noah and spread out like that all across Asia, Europe, Africa, and that sort of thing. So what do we draw from this? Well, something obviously happened. There was lots of water. Everyone's got the same story about it, although it's changed a lot over time. But no, as Christians, we'd say and believe that only the Bible has it straight from the horse's mouth. And from that interpretation and people moving from there, it makes sense that we'd have all these stories and all these variants as a result. All right, so moving on to the technological side rather than the people and the floods. So just a brief recap of what does technology look like. So 300,000 years ago, cavemen, 50,000 years ago, got some language. Very recently, 10,000 years farming, and then written representations in that. And so this is a very, so there's kind of like a whole range of nothing doing for a while. And then here's the thing, and then here's the thing, and then things kind of take off and grow exponentially. And I'll show some examples of that coming. But basically, there's this assumption here that it takes a long time for these things to form and happen. An exponential meaning it doubles over time. So if you double nothing happens. But as you start to double more, then it kind of grows faster and faster and faster over time. And so obviously these time frames don't line up well with the literal interpretation of the Bible of 10,000 years or so. So there's this disparity there. But it does make sense that things would take a long time and slow burn and then take off. If you're starting from a baseline of zero technology, I'm a lizard, I've turned into a monkey, I've turned into a human. How do I harness fire? How do I develop these other things? It's going to take a long time for that to happen. But the assumption here is that they're starting from zero technology, right? Like they didn't have anything to begin with. And that's probably a fair assumption if you're kind of coming from nowhere. But it's not the only explanation, and it's not the only way to consider what happened here. So first, some examples of that exponential growth. So you're probably familiar with the idea of determining eras by their those materials. So Stone Age, Bronze Age, Iron, and so on and so forth. So those ages are getting like stretched out and more pronounced the further we go back, but they're a bit quicker more recently we are. And so the Stone Age was a long time. And they're saying millions of years here, and suddenly it's thousands or hundreds of years as we develop and get better. So that exponential growth. Excuse me. And then moving forth, even more recently, we see that. So printing press, nothing doing, telescope takes off, suddenly rockets, nuclear power, internet, and suddenly we can't keep up technology. It's getting insane. So that's what I mean by exponential growth. But what if the growth wasn't always exponential? What if that long bit at the start didn't need to be a thing? What if we didn't start at ground zero in terms of technology? So in Genesis, it says that the Lord took man and put him in Eden to work and take care of it. And then to Adam, he said, as a result of sin, the ground was cursed, and we now have to toil painfully to get food from the. And so that's farming in the second and third chapter of the Bible. And so it seems from a biblical perspective, that was always God's plan, that we would work, that we would grow things. And so we didn't start from zero. We started from God saying, hey, you should do this. Presumably he told us a little bit about how to do it as well. And maybe we weren't just struggling for language and spread out and just meandering, because biblical perspective says there was Adam and Eve, and then this period of 1,656 years we tend to forget about before Noah's flood and the soft reset on the earth. So that's actually a long time. Imagine as cultures could develop and grow. Imagine if they already had that agriculture to begin with from the period of Adam and Eve. That's a long time to grow and develop and flourish as a result. You would expect a lot faster growth. You don't need that hundreds of thousands of years of, almost groping around in the dark technologically. It will allow things to grow a lot faster and to develop in a shorter time frame, like we might expect if you had a shorter Earth age to begin with. And because people aren't spread too far yet, there's a lot of chance to share that knowledge and innovate and work together and communicate that. Because you can't send a letter if you haven't developed a writing yet. So people would need to be in the same place for technology to be shared and grow in that manner. So I'm talking about some brilliant people as a result. So I've got Isaac Newton here, Albert Einstein, and Steve Jobs. So very different eras, very different things, but they all made this huge mark on the work. And I think most people, like them or not, you would agree that they're brilliant and they're fantastic at what they did, and they've changed the world. And even decades or hundreds of years later, we're still kind of reaping the benefits of that and learning from that. And so I want you to think, what if these men had 800 years on the earth? What could they achieve in 800 years? So it's a bit kind of crazy to think about, because, they only had their 60, 80 years and they made the changes that they did. And yet in the times of the Bibles, we have the lifespans of those early people. And heading up to Noah, in those 1600 years, there was only 10 generations listed in the Bible. And their ages were listed in 800 years, 900 years. And so we think of technology of taking a long time to develop because we started from nothing, and then people with a small lifespan and limited ability to communicate. But what if they had a head start of knowledge of farming and agriculture? What if they lived locally and could communicate with each other? Well, if they lived for 800 years, imagine how good you would get at something if you did it for 800 years. And imagine that expertise and that knowledge, and how many students and generations of students you could pass that knowledge on to. Like, we can't imagine a society that looks like that. We can't even begin to predict how it will grow. But certainly it could grow at a much faster rate than this slow burn that we might have thought in the beginning. And so we don't know much about Noah. I think we're told that Noah was a man of the earth, so presumably he was a farmer. Maybe his son's like a blacksmith and I don't know, whatever. But even if they weren't experts in every field, imagine in their 500-600 years, they would have picked up some different stuff in order to bring into that new world post the flood. Excuse me. So yeah, technology could have happened more recently and more quickly than we might expect, than just by looking at an evolutionary perspective of people. All right, so let's look at the movement of the humans and their language now. And so touched on the idea before of how science works. Well, it collects evidence and interprets, and it reevaluates the ideas as new information comes in light of the evidence. That's good science. That's a good thing. That's good for anyone to do. And so this often happens in the study of human origins. That's a good thing. There's always a new fossil, this new caveman or a new monkey or a new human, whatever it is, and they kind of reevaluate, well, that happened there, that happened then. And they reevaluate, they piece the puzzle together about what they think happened where and when and who it was. However, if you reevaluate and you're getting a thing over here and a thing over here, and it just muddies the waters, it gets out of control, and it reaches to a point where, what do we even believe in the first place? It's great to reevaluate, it's great to refine. But if you're moving the benchmark all over the place, there's a point where it's meaningless. And there's an argument written by the Christian Ministries guys that argue that this is happening entirely. And so these are all taken from like evolutionary scientists and their evidence and their change to their models as a result. There's lots of text, but I'm just going to summarize. You can catch the link in there later when you see this. So they had one example here. So they found a Neanderthal from 124,000 years ago, but they indicated that the genes came from Neanderthals 270,000 years ago. But that doesn't make sense because humans would have had to be in Europe before Africa, but it's an out of Africa theory. So how does that even work? Then there's a Homo sapiens fossil that was, it had its dates changed from 160,000 years to 315,000 years ago, just based on assumptions reevaluated in light of new evidence. And so how do you have this huge change? How can you be that wrong? Or how can you reevaluate by that much if you weren't particularly accurate in the first place? And it would have meant that people would have been in Africa way earlier than thought, and so on, and that kind of thing. So there's lots of these ideas where we're just changing the ballpark for figures and times and places. There's some more examples here, but there's big dramatic changes here, as you can see. Excuse me. And so one person concluded here, this is an evolutionary scientist, saying, with each new find, we significantly alter our understanding, But if we have to rewrite the story so frequently, we might ask whether the plot we're using is wrong to begin with. So refining good, but all over the place, not good. And I think the fact that we see these dramatic changes, and they happen regularly, these aren't isolated examples, shows that perhaps the model isn't as concrete as it's certainly painted in the media and in our secular education institutions. And so you can see a link to all these sources that they come from, and the article, the larger article, talks about it here at this link as well. And so I present a more logical explanation to me is, again, coming from the idea of Noah and then people being spread after the Tower of Babel. So at the top, we got Noah here, his 3 sons, now became these tribes. And so as I mentioned before, a lot of these are places. So Cush is like Ethiopia, Africa, Mizraim's Egypt, and then Canaan was the promised land, and so on and so forth. I think it was about the 4th generation around Nimrod that the Tower of Babel was founded. So 4 generations after the flood, they made the tower, and then God spread them all over the earth, changed their languages. And so we had these people groups, and then they were changed in terms of how they speak. And then we had these specific populations coming from one family member of Noah's family, beginning a new population at those places there. And so, so rather than coming from all these places and being not sure about time and places, hey, there's a flood, these guys started here, and then God sent them all over. And that will kind of make sense for people to spread out in the way that they did. And we actually see this in examples of different cultures and their genealogies. And so at this link, I've got some examples here. You can see those. There are old Irish genealogies that take the royalty, whatever they were, going back all the way to Noah. The 6 Anglo-Saxon royal houses were traced back to Noah by the 8th century historian Nennius. So that had the Franks and the Britons, the Romans, the Albans, and the Goths, and it had all those, and it traced those all the way back to Noah. And there's even Chinese records that describe Noah, who had 3 sons, Lohan, Lo-Shen, and Japhu. Ham, Shem, and Japheth are Noah's sons, according to the Miatsu people of China. So there's some other examples of those links for you to see. But again, like those flood myths that propagated about the world, but changed a little bit over time, even Noah and his lineage and those names have been traced back, even though those names look a little different. We would expect to see those filtering all the way through if those families were in fact taken and put in China by God long ago. And that would be remembered over time by those people. And so again, it just continually seems to line up with that biblical account. All right, so let's talk language. So I've taught this in Year 8 English, and it's very interesting stuff. So this is an example of the Old English epic poem Beowulf. And this is written in English, as you can tell, and totally read. And so while this is English, we can't read it because this was written 1,000 years ago. And so language changes over time. Anyone who's used the internet will know that. And it takes about 1,000 years of complete separation for a language to become unrecognizable. And so we're 1,000 years separated from the writer of Beowulf. I cannot read that, even though it is my language, English. Whereas Shakespeare's only about 400 years ago. It's a struggle, but I can read it. I can understand what's going on. And so it's clear that language changes over time. And so obviously people groups that their languages are going to develop over time, especially if they've been there for however many thousands of years, post the Tower of Babel and being distributed around the earth. And so while language develops, it doesn't change entirely, right? There are some clear links. Why do we call this English? Because there's still some similarities. So there's similarities in the characters used, there's similarities in the sounds, how groups of characters relate to sounds, and how roots of words refer to particular things. And so by looking at those little bits and pieces, we can kind of group the 6,912 distinct languages of today. We can group them into language families because English has it has French words, and it has Latin, it has Greek words. And so we can kind of trace those lineages back to those languages. And if we do that, we can break these languages down and group them into about 94 language families. But what we can't do is we can't bring those 94 languages back further, right? So evolutionarily, it would have made sense that in the beginning, the cavemen or early humans, they would have developed one single language. And as they spread out, that one single language would have developed and come from that. But we should be able to trace that language back to that single source that it came from, the first person to develop that communication. But what linguists aren't able to do is they're not able to marry those 94 language families. They're not able to see those links and group them into larger superfamilies. They're not able to find links between those. And so that doesn't make sense if they had this evolutionary common ancestor, a beginning of, an originator of communication. Whereas 94 language families would make more sense of the biblical account, where God took that single language, scrambled it, gave them to different people groups, maybe 94 different people groups, 94 languages, sent them off about the earth. And so while those languages have developed since then to all these other languages, they have these distinct beginnings of when God supernaturally changed those in those people groups at the Tower of Babel. All right, so again, a lot of stuff. So I just want to touch on the things that happened before the flood. So common ancestors, where did we come from? Can we kind of trace our origins back to an originator of one person? Yes, we can. Was the earth covered by water? Yes. Why is that? Well, depends on your perspective. Learn about how the movement of humans and how that kind of aligns in terms of a times perspective that lines up with the Bible, even though the scientific model changes and shifts at times. And it makes sense too, the development of technology and language, those times frames and those mechanisms would fit with the biblical account too, rather than some of the puzzles presented by the scientific evidence we might have for the day. And so that's kind of leading up to the flood. And next time we'll look at the flood itself, the evidence for it and how it happened and the impacts it had on the world after the fact, because it's a global event. It's going to be a big deal. And so I'll finish with Romans 15:4. If everything was written in the past, was written to teach us in the Bible, so that through endurance to on the scriptures, we can the encouragement they provide, we might have hope. And at the end, I've got the reference list, so you can, there are all the links that are throughout that, but I've written where they're from and a little bit more detail about what they are. So if you're interested, you can click on those and check those out. So again, thanks for tuning in. We'll see you next time, and we'll be covering Noah's flood then and what it's meant for the world. Thanks.